Welcome to the Urbe Ad Astra podcast, episode 4. Bright and Dark Ages, with historian and journalist David M. Perry. This episode is brought to you by Perhaps the Stars, the fourth and final novel in Ada Palmer's Terra Ignota series, available now in the UK and in the US on November the 2nd, wherever fine books are sold.
Hello all, welcome to the Urbe podcast, where we talk about the craft of writing, history, science fiction, fantasy, science, and other nifty topics.
Hello, I'm Jo Walton, science fiction and fantasy writer and vocateur reader.
And I'm Ada Palmer, also an SF novelist and a historian of European thought, censorship, books, the Renaissance, among other things, and these days, how people write about Machiavelli based on reading different bits of Machiavelli and not reading other bits of Machiavelli.
And today, we're going to talk about Dark Ages and Bright Ages with our awesome friend David M. Perry.
Hello, everyone.
Thanks for coming, David. Do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, I am a medieval historian and journalist. I write about so many things for many different outlets as a journalist, but as a historian, I was a historian of medieval Venice. I'm very interested in how people try to construct usable pasts in the Middle Ages, but also, as of yesterday and more broadly, the way that people take their past, and then they try to tell a useful story for themselves. So that's what I do as a historian. And I'm at the University of Minnesota, and now I advise undergraduates and try to convince them that the only path to happiness is through the study of history.
Well, I think in many ways, I often think of it as the only path to power, or to having the ability to resist false claims that manipulate power, is through the study of history.
Well, I like to go with happiness, but I think your claim may be more accurate.
Well, this spring, as a graduation farewell wish to our history majors who were graduating with social distancing, they asked all the faculty to pick a different word that relates to how we feel about history, and then give a short comment to the students about it. And after thinking about lots of ones that were either fun or warm, I ended up settling on truth, and how many false claims about history get used to make bids at power, which I think is something that our discussion today will touch on. Which makes me realize I think we should begin with defining a term that I bet we're going to use over and over and over, which is legitimacy. So this is a term I know, David, you and I are very used to thinking about and talking about as historians, which is legitimacy is when somebody is trying to, claim that they have the right to authority, the right to exist, the right to hold power, the right to keep the things that they have, the right to do whatever it is that they're doing. And there are lots of different tools that one can use to try to claim legitimacy. And there's also lots of different peoples and things that try to claim legitimacy. So governments claim legitimacy. Individual people try to claim legitimacy. Brands try to claim legitimacy. Banks, when they make their bank building, have a pediment and columns on the front so that it feels very solid and ancient and authoritative and worthy of respect and like something that'll last 1,000 years. That is that dinky bank branch with its recycled architecture, of which there might be 1,000 identical copies in 1,000 towns, trying to claim a kind of legitimacy.
When I teach big history surveys, particularly which I love doing, when I know a lot of faculty historians don't like teaching the big surveys that cover thousands and thousands of years because it's hard, but also it feels superficial. I always took it as a real privilege because almost always, it is the only history class that student will take as an undergraduate, and likely the last history class they will take in their life. So that's a little sad, but also there's a lot to learn and a lot to study, and it's an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity to teach not a set of content that the student must know, but rather ways of thinking that may support them going forward. And political legitimacy in particular was always one of my themes. Other ones came and went, and I always taught it the same way by having them articulate ways in which governments assert legitimacy in their own lives, and they'll talk about uniforms and inaugurations and voting and architecture and any number of other things. And then that becomes a category that we assess as we move through time and space. And whatever the survey is, a world history survey might cover the world, a European history survey more geographically focused, but still this question of legitimacy as a way that I'm hoping students will be thoughtful about, and that not all claims of legitimacy are Machiavellian to sort of dabble in your narratives, or sneaky or manipulative in false ways. Sometimes I think claims of legitimacy can be legitimate, but that they're always claims. They're always trying to do some kind of work.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we want to think of a kind of claim of legitimacy that we would really want to respect, I think of the Library of Congress building, and how when they were decorating the interior of the Library of Congress building, these early founders tried to take a whole bunch of quotations that they thought were good and worthy sentiments for a republic in which all the citizenry were going to be co-equal participants in this way that they were experimenting with, to paint all over the walls and say, our legitimacy isn't going to be royal courts of arms, it's going to be this saying from Plato and this saying from Augustine and this saying from Voltaire that we think espouse values that are good for a republic that's trying to advance equality. And there's a lot of sincerity behind that set of choices. There's also a lot of calculation.
And we can both admire the sincerity, and we can admire the sentiments, and we can note whose voices are missing, and what it would look, what else it might look like, and where what messages the silences or absences are also saying.
Right. And not just, for example, if we made a 2021 version of that, which different quotations we would pick and which different figures we might include or exclude. But even if we were time travelers and got to go advise them in, 1790 as to what quotations that they already had at the time we would recommend that they forefront or not, our recommendations might be slightly different because of our different historical perspective.
I will absolutely read that story if either of you write it.
Well, and I think, and Joe, you will be a great font of examples as well. Even though in, say, a science fiction or fantasy or fictional setting, the word legitimacy doesn't come up very often, writers are very aware of this and will depict moments when they're establishing their science fictional space empire or their fantastical government, or even the historical context that is being described, whether in fiction or nonfiction. They'll describe many of the tools of legitimacy. They'll describe the feeling of awe on the long walk up the carpet toward the spiky imperial throne, or they'll describe the fashion and the fanciness of the vehicle with which a very wealthy family's representative arrives at a party. Or they'll describe, even in a post-apocalyptic biker gang or a Simpsons parody of a post-apocalyptic biker gang, you put skulls on the top of the throne and you have a crown made out of an old orange traffic cone. And these are jokes, but they are parodies of our understanding that tools of legitimacy and the accumulation of these accoutrements and ways of representing legitimacy are something that all eras and all moments, and especially all transformations like a post-apocalyptic setting are going to employ.
There's something different but related that I wanted to say connected to legitimacy is that I've thought a lot about what makes an artistic golden age. And why it is that we seem to have these golden ages when people are always creating art. But we do seem to have these sort of golden ages where there is a sort of synthesis of people coming together, making particular kinds of art. And you have a whole bunch of people in particular areas, and some of it is influence, and that the other people are there to show it to, and there's always a lot more people than you think when you superficially look at that, and there are always women that are invisible when you look at it from a distance. But one of the things that you very often get with these clusters is that the money that is funding it is coming from somebody who feels that their legitimacy is slightly dodgy, and they want to use the art to shore up their claims to legitimacy. So you get that, for instance, in Periclean Athens. And you get that in Augustus funding all of this in Rome when he's just set up the empire.
Can you give us a little expansion on Periclean Athens for listeners who aren't super familiar?
Well, that's when we have all of the Greek tragedy and Greek comedy that survives. And it was a sort of theatrical golden age at a time when Athens was a democracy that had beaten the greatest empire, Persia, or at least they hadn't exactly beaten it, but they'd stopped Persia conquering them. And they were making their own imperial claim on bits of Greece, but as a democracy without a king. As men only, but a very, very thorough kind of democracy.
Right.
And this is also the time that Plato and Socrates and then Plato were around. So it's a time that we look at as this sort of wonderful age, and there was also all this sculpture happening that people have imitated ever since. But at a time when Athens itself had this slightly dubious claim, and the people with money had this slightly dubious claim.
Right. Because they didn't have the traditional form of government that the neighbors are primed to respect and expect to be normal. So that's one reason to feel you need extra legitimacy. And you also have people who've moved into power who haven't recently been moved into power, which is a second reason that people try to claim legitimacy. And you also have ambition and the desire to claim to have the authority to exert power over people nearby and beyond your borders, which is another reason that cultures often feel like they need extra legitimacy to justify that claim.
And I would certainly jump in with all these medieval examples. The classic one would be the rise of the Carolingian dynasty in early medieval France, in both historical and literary, writing of histories, but also building buildings and on all the work being done there. I'm particularly interested in the Venice in the first half of the 13th century, which is not a golden age in the sense that it has come down over the past 650 years or whatever it is as an age of great innovation. But in fact, it is an age of great innovation in this very narrow space on this particular island in the moment of upheaval around the Mediterranean after the conquest of Constantinople in the Fourth Crusade. And then, of course, there's the whole Italian Renaissance, which I always like to joke didn't happen. But in fact, there is a moment of artistic innovation that then has been recognized as kind of a golden age from an artistic standard, but which, Ada, you always like to emphasize was a time of terrible, terrible political chaos and upheavals.
Yes, and war and plague. Joe?
But if I can just sort of give one sort of example of that from that, it isn't Ferrara, where the dukes were very firmly established in their power, that all of this outpouring of art came from. It was Florence, where the Medici were behind the scenes in power, and that we're using that as a form of legitimacy. The people who felt really legitimate didn't, at least until later, feel the need for as much as that.
Yeah, and Renaissance Florence in that moment has all three of the same characteristics of Periclean Athens, which is to say, it's a republic in a world where monarchy is the more standard form of government that people more easily understand and respect. So you have an extra feeling of we need to make up for that by having extra claims of legitimacy from other directions. You also had a dubious claim to power and people that have just moved into exerting power in a way that they didn't before and that they expect people to doubt. This is the Medici exerting power in the city. And they also are trying to exert imperial claims over neighboring towns in Tuscany, over places like the city of Pisa, which Florence was constantly trying to conquer because it was a port city, and other neighboring areas trying to expand from being a city to being a region. And for all three of those reasons, you then feel you need an extra justification of, yes, these two cities were both founded by the Romans and are basically equally old, but we should be the ruling city and they should be the other city because, well, we have some dubious histories that our humanists have piled together, but also we have this play about the foundation of our city and how great it was, and also we have these beautiful illuminated manuscripts of the version of the history of stuff that claims that we're better than our neighbors, but also look at our enormous have you seen the size of our enormous dome? Isn't it obviously the case that anybody who could build such an enormous dome is obviously worthy of, and powerful and so on, so that you are more feeling awe. And there's nothing in European statecraft that says enormous dome equals therefore legitimate power. But when you're standing in front of it and you stare at it and you have this feeling of awe and amazement, that creates legitimacy and indeed connects not only to just the artistic element, but also the expense, the engineering complexity. Italy does this wonderful thing where they have stripy cathedrals. Other places have very tall cathedrals, but Italy has stripy cathedrals. Because when you make your cathedral stripy, you're importing expensive colored marble from someplace else. And when we look at these stripy cathedrals, they look ridiculous, and we sort of snicker at them, especially the black and white. They're great.
I love them.
They're great, but I didn't snicker the first time I saw one when I was like 16, and I saw the Cathedral of Siena. I was like, "What? It looks like convict stripes from a silent film." And then you look at it and you get more used to it. But every person who saw it in the period was literate in the fact that that expensive black marble had to be imported from somewhere far away and was therefore proof of powerful trade contacts and wealth, which are other ways of exerting and communicating legitimacy.
One of the things when it comes to art that, in this context that interests me, again, emerging out of specific shifts in Venice, is when publicly demonstrating innovation and change, even if it's innovation that is, and we're like the Romans from 1,000 years ago, there's still a very clear 14th century Florentine claims about innovation versus claims about continuity and conservatism in the sense of, we're not changing anything. This has always been this way. And in Venice, you have these moments in which initially in my period, Venetians are very excited to claim newness, new families, new government, new republic, new money, new buildings, new art. And then as things get more and more dodgy for them, they start to claim oldness. And there's a myth of a Trojan founding. There are new histories written that assert kind of Romanness as well, and Roman status going back farther. There's a whole rewriting of Venetian history over centuries in which newness is no longer the pathway to legitimacy. It's oldness, and in fact, the oldness is new, if that makes sense. They're writing new histories that had never been told in Venice before about themselves, but they're doing it in order to make a different kind of claim. And I think there are lots of moments in which there is artistic innovation happening, but it doesn't always read that way to us because it is deliberately obscuring the innovation because it's more useful in terms of legitimacy to hide it.
Yeah, that's a major thing, is when innovation will be made under the pretense of it being a restoration of something old or that was there before, because things that go back a long time, that are stable, that come from an earlier golden age, are major things that make you feel that things are legitimate. One of my favorites in Florence is the Baptistry, which is the symbol of the city for a little while. It's on their flag. It's this no, it's octagonal. No, it's hexagonal. No, it's octagonal. It's octagonal. A baptistry. It's right in front of where the cathedral now is, though it's older. And it's stripy, it's green and white, and on the inside has this gorgeous Byzantine-looking gold mosaic ceiling that's just stunning when you walk in. But within 100 years of its construction, we have documents claiming that it was a rehabilitation of an ancient Roman temple of Mars. The grandson of the architect who designed it is still alive, and yet people are claiming that it was an ancient Roman temple of Mars, and they have diagrams of this temple, which looks nothing like any real Roman temple that ever could have possibly existed, and it's round and octagonal. It has a equestrian statue of Mars in the middle on top of a pillar, but it feels legitimate, and it feels to people like this building is so important, it must be an ancient Roman building, so that the myth kind of constructs itself in the midst of things very natively. And in a sense, I think it's easy for us to feel as if you can either claim old or you can claim new and innovation as if they're polar. And it would also be easy to imagine that there's a sort of a conservative versus progressive bent to it. But in so many of these examples, things are claiming old and new at the same time.
Absolutely.
Or pretending that the new thing is old, or pretending that an old thing is new, or, oh, I have an ancient Roman lion, I'll carve a new ancient Roman lion to put next to it so that there's a pair of them and they can be symmetrical and match. Oh, but the ancient Roman lion doesn't look as nice as the new lion because it's all worn out. We'll recarve the face of the ancient Roman lion to match the new lion that we made to match the ancient lion. So the old and new get interwoven in a whole lot of different ways that constantly renew, and also do just make it much harder to think of what felt innovative at the time and what felt ancient at the time, because the answer would often be both.
Yeah. I in Venice, if you walk into San Marco, there are these rectangular plaques surrounding the doors, and some of them are quite old and were taken from Byzantium in the Fourth Crusade as spoils, and some of them were new, constructed by Venetian artists, and they look a little different, but they have similar iconographies. And I actually think this is one of the things that medieval art is particularly good at, is the layering of meanings all at once in often very simple images, in which all of the meanings are, in the eyes of the medieval consumer the medieval gaze, all of those meanings are equally legitimate at the same time. And one person might think one way or think another, be more interested in one kind of narrative than another. But that the goal is to take an image and layer as many things on top of it as possible, rather than achieve a kind of a simple narrative. And maybe you'll tell me that you feel Renaissance artists did that as well. But I think because of my sense is that the power of the classical origin narrative, or the classical Renaissance, the Renaissance narrative, kind of erases some of the layering that medieval artists are so good at.
I mean, I think that it results in the creation of a lot of pieces and mixing of pieces that are trying to skip the Middle Ages and pieces that are trying to include it. Because, very briefly, the Renaissance decides that there was this Middle Age and that it was bad.
Petrarch. Let's not say the Renaissance. Let's blame Petrarch.
But we have to also blame Bruni, because Bruni,
I'm also happy to blame Bruni. I'm happy to blame both of them. That's fine.
And then so Petrarch comes along and says, we live in an age of ash and shadow, and everything is terrible because the papacy was taken away from Rome, and also my parents were in exile, and also writing sad poems is literarily appropriate, and we live in an age of ash and shadow, and we need to change it and make something better. Perhaps we can have a golden age. And then Bruni, who's a generation and a half later, is, hey, yes, we have made a golden age. This is totally a golden age. This is definitely a golden age. There was an ancient golden age, and then there was a middle piece, and now I'm dividing history in three, and now we're in another golden age. Look, we just defeated Milan in a battle. And the Duke of Milan gets a copy of this history that Bruni wrote and was like, no, they didn't. My granddad was leading the battle, then he dropped dead of a fever and went home, and there wasn't a battle, and they didn't win. What? And Bruni said, well, I have written the history, and there are hundreds of copies of it all over the place, and now everybody believes that Florence beat you in a battle. And Milan is like, quick, hire a historian to write a history of Milan in which we win the battle. Because, as I like to say,
if only there was more quick hire a historian moments in our modern world.
Quick hire a historian. Well, I think in a weird way there are, but as I like to summarize that moment, history isn't written by the winners. History is written by the people who write histories. And a lot of histories get written all around us daily in tiny fragments, in claims that are made in a quick newspaper article or blog post about the history of an object or the history of a holiday or the history of the struggle to create a holiday. Every one of those is writing a history and choosing where to begin. Where do the eras start and where do they stop? Which moments in the history between, the event that this commemorates and the holiday actually passing, do we want to celebrate or connect or separate? That does happen, but it doesn't happen very much in the I'm going to write a book-length history the way it did with Bruni and others, but it happens in the blog post-length history or the court case amicus brief justification length history, etc. But in the Renaissance, it would be, a book-length history, and soon everybody is commissioning book-length histories and here I think I'll directly connect back, David, to your point about medieval versus Renaissance and layering. These histories are amazing. And so you get the king of Hungary wanting, because he's super illegitimate and just claimed the throne by war and charisma. And he wants to be legitimate. And, one way you do that is marry a princess. And one way you do that is marry a really smart princess who has Latin and Greek and great taste and have her import stuff from her rich Italian family and make your Capitol building look super impressive. But another is that you commission a history of your family that claims, and it's an amazing history, and it claims that he's descended from Julius Caesar's generals, but also from Genghis Khan. And it has this amazing mix of classical and recent and what a Greek would call barbaric, and Western and Eastern, and just all of them. You could have all the kinds of legitimacy. You could be descended from all the things. And you can have saints in your lineage, and you can have conquerors in your lineage, and you just sort of stack them on top of each other. But that kind of history isn't exciting to 19th century people who are the ones who decide what the canon is.
Right.
Which Renaissance books you can get in a Penguin paperback.
Right.
And those people are much more interested in skipping over the Middle Ages and going from the Renaissance based everything on classical, and they didn't do this layering all the in-between bits. And that process doesn't only happen for literature, it happens for art. And so, the Mona Lisa is possibly the least informationally dense Madonna that exists.
Yeah.
Right? Because the Madonna, of which there are thousands, is often on a visible chair with interesting characteristics that say things about art and region and style. She's usually against the background of a building that make claims about what type of setting is worthy to host her. She's often wearing fabrics where you can tell things about the expense of the fabric, or if you're a really good artist. I've walked around the National Portrait Gallery and the National and in London and the National Gallery as well, with a textile historian who could look at a painting and tell you, that shoulder velvet that the Madonna has, that velvet is from Genoa. You can tell by looking. And there's so much informational density to a lot of Renaissance material, which does continue to use layering like medieval artists did, but that 19th century people didn't like. And so when they cull it down to the few iconic things, they don't include that layered, rich stuff.
And I'm always happy when I'm not blaming Petrarch to blame the 19th century. Those are the
Yes.
those are the people I blame, is Petrarch in the 19th century, and I guess Bruni now as well. So
Yes.
I'm very comfortable with that.
I've just found another reason why, Matthias Corvinus, the Raven King, King of Hungary, awesome person,
Yes.
that I'd never heard of.
Mm.
And I've just found out yesterday, in fact. I was reading a short story by William Morris in which he's mentioned, a 19th century William Morris, well-known curtain designer, in which he says, of course, Matthias Corvinus' father was illegitimate.
Oh, right. Yes.
And that's enough. The 19th century, have this far more so than any earlier period. This horror of bastardy.
Yeah, you're making me remember, Joe, the really odd night. It's a 1890s. The most recent biography in English of the Medici popes, Leo X and Clement VII, is from 1894-ish, and it basically, with Clement, the entire thing is everything went wrong and the Reformation became bad and the French Wars of Religion happened and Rome was terrible because Clement was illegitimate. And if he hadn't been illegitimate, everything was fine. And my favorite line from its bit on Leo, who is the legitimate predecessor, was there's a famous incident when Leo was, his real name is Giovanni, but when he was a tiny kid, like 4 or 5, and his tutor Poliziano was trying to pick the new text for him to study in Latin class and wanted to do Ovid, and his mother Clarice wanted it to be the Psalms, and there was a fight between the teacher and the mother over, is it going to be Ovid or the Psalms? And in the end it was Ovid, and the biographer says, and if it had been the Psalms, the Reformation would never have happened.
That's amazing. That is an amazing argument about contingency, which, along with legitimacy, is one of the one of the things I like to think about and talk about and teach about.
This is Herbert Vaughan's The Medici Popes, Leo X and Clement VII. If anybody wants to skip that book, I thought it would be good to know what book it was.
Well, and the scary thing about it, and this I think touches on both legitimacy and problems with the ongoing effort to try to correct bad narratives about the Middle Ages. The Herbert Vaughan book, which you can find on Amazon as a Kindle book or a print-on-demand book, with the publication date, I think it's 2013 or 2014. Yeah. Because it was made into a Kindle book then, and that's the date that it shows, and you cannot tell that this book is 120 years out of date.
So it, as you two know, but as our listeners don't, I have this new book coming out, The Bright Ages. That is a history of the Middle Ages. And part of what, we can talk about how my co-author, Matt Gabriel, he's a professor at Virginia Tech, and how we came up with where we would start and where we would end. That we were sort of touching on that. How do you tell these stories? That was an interesting set of conversations and attempts and failures until we found our strand. But also part of what really motivated it is we were and part of it was Matt was at the British Museum and was looking at histories in the British Museum Library on the Middle Ages, and they were terrible. And they were old. And then he said this to me over Google Chat or something, and called me, and I looked it up, and if you go on Amazon and you look for histories of the Middle Ages, you're going to see Norman Cantor from the 1960s, still one of the top selling histories of the Middle Ages. And there's a lot of problems with Cantor in terms of his views of, I would say, of women and of Jews and of other issues. But also, we've learned a lot about the Middle Ages since the 1960s. And then another one is sort of from the early 90s by William Manchester, who's better known as a popular biographer of people like Winston Churchill, but wrote this book called A World Lit Only by Fire, right? So that's the Dark Ages, but lit only by fire. And it's terrible. It's terrible. And even good ones like Barbara Tuchman's A Distant Mirror is really just 14th century England. It also, we've also learned a lot about 14th century England, and there's a lot of work. There's a lot of things that I would criticize about that book, but I think it is at least a richly informed book. But it's not the Middle Ages. If you want a history of the Middle Ages, you're really, the algorithms are going to send you Norman Cantor from the 1960s, or maybe this book from the 19th century, republished. And we've just learned a lot since then. And that was really a big motivator to sort of drop what we were doing and to try to write and sell this book.
And David, I'm sure you, just like me this year, experienced how often we were asked by journalists variations on did the Black Death cause a golden age, and therefore, or cause the Renaissance, which is a golden age, and therefore is COVID going to cause an economic boom, and should we all be buying stock?
Right.
And
I actually have a file. I never wrote the essay, but I have a file on essentially the Black Death ended feudalism. Can COVID end capitalism? That's the one. And the answer is no, the Black Death didn't end feudalism, and no, COVID is not going to end capitalism. And side note, there was no such thing as feudalism. But I mean, just article after article, including some that quoted very good historians, saying, "Oh yeah, the Black Death ended feudalism," and I know how hard it is sometimes to talk to journalists and to get your points out right, but it was I'm not sure that we being historians
served that well,
or we being journalists, I can be both we's, served the public well in that particular take that got published again and again and again.
Well, and certainly in the "Did it cause an economic boom" one, there are certain histories of the Black Death that were written like in the 1930s based on research from bits of England that I've read that are definitely the source of that, and that were good history at the time, but we did more research since then, and the data we had then, that was right. And so the journalists are sort of doing their homework because they're going to the library or they're going online and they're looking at this book and it says this about the Black Death, and it has lots of charts and numbers, and it's written in academic prose, and it was published by Oxford and Cambridge. But we've done more work on that since, and getting across you're not wrong. This source isn't wrong because it's a bad source. The source is simply wrong because we've learned more since, and lots of people aren't expecting. We've learned more since. How can we learn more about the Black Death? Haven't we known about the Black Death continually for hundreds of years? Well, yes and no. We've learned more about the Black Death because we read more records and analyzed more DNA and dug up more graveyards, and history has new tools. I think a lot of people...
And we understand the Black Death as a, 300-year event rather than a 10-year event. So then, was there an economic boom? Well, when, right? And is, at a specific time and place, was there some positive economic results as connected to population depletion? Yeah, sure. But, we're talking about 300 years, a lot of things.
And also a lot of places. A lot of places where, the result is this here and this there, depending on what the local economy is. This a luxury economy? Is this a import-export economy? Is this a very localized economy? Yeah.
Have you ever run across the thing where people argue about why the Black Death didn't happen in Poland? And the truth is, the Black Death did happen in Poland. We just didn't have any records.
I mean, I haven't seen a particular one, but yeah.
Because we didn't have the records and nobody was looking at Poland, when you looked at a map, there was no death toll for Poland. So people had all of these like 15 different arguments for why Poland was exempt from the Black Death, where the truth was people hadn't done the research.
Right. I mean, that happens a lot. I have taught classes of the Black Death with maps that have Poland empty, and I taught it, in fact, in Chicago at Dominican University, where I was a professor. And as with all Chicago Catholic schools, it is packed with people of Polish descent and people who are, and people who are Polish. And so I, in fact, had that very conversation. Now that you bring it up, I forgot about it quite a lot. And I said, well, I don't know. I don't know what is going on in Poland. So I'm sort of glad you raised it. I just wrote a piece, just in January, or maybe it came out in March, on the Black Death. A historian named Monica Green, really just an incredible force for advancing knowledge on medieval medicine, but particularly around the Second Plague pandemic, which is a better, more technical term for the Black Death. And she's pushed the origin of when we think that pandemic started to move into the 13th century. And she finds again and again, people didn't see that the old narrative was the Mongols conquered, and then towards the end, Mongol empire's dominance, the Black Death started to move. But in fact, the Black Death was there the whole time as the Mongol conquering. And the reason people see it is they didn't look for it.
Because we were so confident that it wasn't
there yet. But it's right there in sources about Baghdad in the 1250s. It's right there. She has argued, and I've been persuaded. I have to actually read the part says, "Hey, there's a disease here," and then trace the grain carriages back to the Tian Shan Mountains in Central Asia, where we know, in fact, the marmots had the Black Death and had Yersinia pestis, and it was beginning to mutate and do the aDNA work, and it's a decade of work in those trends, as I've just said, and other people's work. She talks a lot about a Chinese historian who reached out to her, says, I think I'm seeing something that looks like black bubonic plague in the 1200s, but obviously it can't be. It could be Yersinia pestis, but it can't be the Yersinia pestis that becomes the strain that goes across the world, because that's too early. But it kind of seems like it wasn't too early. Right now, we don't have a lot of data on Yersinia pestis. It'll be a different strain. Monica thinks, this is again not my work, in sub-Saharan Africa. But no one's really looked for it yet. So what will we find, right? And that until you start looking, you don't find it. On the other hand, my father, who was an academic, is an academic, still with us, always used to say, the sources always say yes. That was one of his famous quotes. And so you have to be careful, because if you ask a question of the sources, they might say yes. And it might be more about the question you ask than about what's there. So, I mean, this is the work of the historian, and it's great. It's wonderful work.
Yeah. Well, and you've made me think a lot about how this, we know the Black Death was in 1348, therefore asking whether it's around before doesn't happen very often, is similar to a lot of problems with the medieval versus Renaissance, because there's so many things that Renaissance texts or 19th century texts about the Renaissance claim the Renaissance is doing for the first time, or even 20th century museum labels in a museum with a Renaissance thing that will tell you this is the first time anyone did blah. And then we have lots of medieval people doing blah. And people will come forward and say, look, medieval people are doing blah. And it's very difficult to get that integrated into the others, because the narrative of, no, there was this one moment of blossoming and innovation, etc., is so easy to tell and so desirable to tell, because, circling way back, you can use a golden age to claim legitimacy. And if you can compare yourself to the golden age, we have the spirit of the Renaissance. Our rivals, therefore, are like the bad Dark Ages.
Right.
It's such a valuable tool for feeling and seeming important in everything from, startup companies' corporate logos to what type of architecture a government uses for a new building. They'll use different forms of invoking something that has been defined as a golden age, very frequently the Renaissance or the ancient Mediterranean Greco-Roman world, but sometimes it'll be a much more recent golden age. It'll be the golden 1950s, or it'll be Reagan, but these micro golden ages. But so many people are comfortable with them and use them as their metrics for thinking about the subdivisions, that picking on them and trying to overturn them, as both you and I do, is just a very uphill battle for a lot of different reasons.
I'm always very interested in the word again in the Trump slogan, "Make America Great Again," because he didn't, and they keep America great. But I'm just, as a historian, that again struck me from the first moment. I saw it, that it's just. It's making a historical claim about when was good and was great,
right?
And it's very familiar to us from other moments in history where people are making. Is it let's become, or is it great again? I think that looking at this, going where we started on legitimacy, that I think that's really that you can do a lot of work by saying, are they saying again or new? What's the claim here about time, or both at the same time?
Yeah, and I think one thing about that phrase is that it doesn't require pinning down which golden age of an earlier era you're invoking, so that it can, make X great again can invoke generically Reagan and the 1950s and an imagined golden age in the early foundation and founding fathers era all simultaneously. But it's all very similar to, Petrarch and Bruni are not saying, let's have an artistic rebirth and be great. They're saying, our ancestors were the Romans. They did all this stuff. They were great. They conquered all of our current enemies. Let's do that again. And then if it's somewhere like Hungary, when the king of Hungary is claiming to be descended from friends of Julius Caesar, Hungary was never Rome, and yet there's still an again claim of our ruler was Rome, and therefore we can roam again, even though Hungary was never even quite part of the empire. That the innovation and claims of returning to an earlier moment of power go together.
Well, this is why the Trojan origin myth for Venice that comes up really in the 14th century is so interesting to me, because Venice is not an important place under the Roman Empire. It's a place where they have salt. And then in the Lombard invasion, at least the narrative is that people fled onto the islands of the lagoon where the Roman fleet could defend them better, and that's when Venice starts to build. And Venice is very proud of its early medieval Byzantine origins, and then it's declaring independence, and then it's becoming an empire. It's very proud of its narrative of newness until it doesn't work anymore, and then there needs to be this attempt to create a Trojan origin. And Aeneas goes to Rome, but Brutus comes to Venice, as well as to England and many other places.
Yes. Yes, I wrote a sonnet once about how when we have colonies on the moon, they'll claim they were actually founded by Trojans. Because we all come. It's Western culture's claim to legitimacy is Troy.
Being founded by, because sometimes it'll be Trojans, but sometimes it'll be that guy who was mentioned once in the Aeneid who was clearly with Aeneas, and then afterward he went over here and founded our town.
So I became a medievalist in the sense of the moment in my undergraduate career when I thought I'm at least going to focus on medieval history as an undergraduate. It was just a medieval survey, and we were writing a research paper, and I went to the library and I pulled out a copy of what they then called the AngloSaxon Chronicle, and we could have a longer conversation about Anglo-Saxon, though there are people who know better. We wouldn't call that now. We'd call that maybe early English monastic annals. But anyway, it's these texts that have come down to us as sort of a single narrative, but in fact are many of them. And they often begin with genealogies. And at a certain point, the genealogies of the kings go back to Odin. And then about 100 years later, it's the same genealogy, goes back to Odin, and then it keeps going, and it goes back to Adam. But it's just these, and I remember I was maybe 19 or 20, sitting there with this edition of this source I didn't really understand, but seeing on one page a genealogy going back to Odin and a second page a genealogy going back to Adam, and just thinking, I need to keep reading.
That's a great reading. I mean, I have a similar vivid memory of the first time I read the prologue to Snorri's Prose Edda, which has at the beginning there was Adam and Eve, and then their descendants were the Trojans, and Priam's son was Thor, and Thor's grandson was Odin, and Thor was married to the Delphic Sibyl, who we call Sif. And Loki
Snorri does take it. Snorri does take it up a notch for sure.
And you're just, wow, the world where all these things connect in that way. I want to dive into this world head first. This is an amazing world.
Yeah. It was the spark. I mean, I love that. I love that text too. And Snorri, for people who don't know, Snorri Sturluson, I can never quite get his last name, is really the reason. Medieval Icelandic monk, and he's the reason that we have a lot of these Norse myths preserved in the forms that they are preserved. They're preserved in other ways too, but this is the fullest one. It was the sparseness of these early annals that really grabbed me, that they were doing it. Snorri is doing it at length, perhaps protesting too much. Whereas these annals just, here's a monk just writing it down. No qualms, no embarrassment, at least preserved in the text, just simple. Here's genealogy 1, here's genealogy 2. No big deal.
He wasn't actually a monk, was he?
Yeah, he was. No. He was.
I thought not.
Yeah, because he was married to the wealthiest widow in Iceland, and there was a complicated thing. But anyway,
I sit corrected, and gladly so. Yeah.
No, but and I think that's actually very telling, because Snorri is a statesman who's dealing with dynasties and foreign kings, and his choice law speaker of the whole thing, and he has this very elaborate and complex weaving together of these genealogies, which also has an apologia, it has a defense, and therefore it is important to learn these myths that I'm about to recount about Odin and so on, because now you understand how the pagan parts of them are not true, but we still need to know them so that we can understand poetry and write poetry. And now that I've explained to you how the genealogies work, and you know that it's not real on the divine level, now you're prepared to be able to study the myths and blah, 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 blah. And whereas the medieval monk is just very comfortable having, this is the truth of the reality I live in, and I'm not worried and anxious about explaining it and justifying it and giving an apologia to say why it's therefore okay to continue to use this other material. This material is just comfortably mixed together. And I think that's a difference between the person for whom this is in the spotlight in the middle of a political situation where he knows he's at risk, he knows he's playing with fire, he knows that the court is a violent place to be, as opposed to a medieval monk who has got the longest life expectancy of anybody in civilization, and except for medieval nuns who live even longer. If you want to survive in the past, be a nun. This is definitely the correct choice. But who can just comfortably reflect to us that this is a part of a lived reality, as opposed to where Snorri makes it seem more controversial. That monk shows us that it's actually uncontroversial, and that the controversy is born from moving it into places where it's being entangled with narratives of power.
And this is one of the words. So one of the words that we use in the Bright Ages a lot is the word permeable. Which say that medieval culture is permeable at all times, but in all ways. So we're talking about pagan and Christian, but we could also talk about the movement of peoples or things. People who look very different from each other, speak different languages, the movement of languages. One of the great, and there are people who've worked on this. One of the sort of the great missing pieces of the medieval past are all the creoles and pidgin languages, which occasionally you get a mention of in another text. Oh, the mixed language that the sailors speak, right? But they're not being written into a form that survives in any sort of comprehensive way. But of course, in the Mediterranean, and they were speaking, randomized Latin, Arabic, and then whatever other language they're speaking, all mixed together, because that's how languages work. And this is important for us because there's this idea that the Middle Ages are monoculture and monochromatic, which is to say white, the European Middle Ages, and flavorless, right? No flavor, no spices in their food, nothing, no luxury goods, nothing right? And all these things are not true. They may be more true in one place or another at any given time, but if we're looking at just the European Middle Ages, which is the phrase I try to use rather than, the whole world had a history in the year 1100. I'm talking about the European Middle Ages. But even just narrowing in there, permeable is the word that I like to use, because that's what the evidence shows.
Well, and I think this connects very well to the updating and older studies, because I've often played the game of following through footnotes or talking with people about, the source of things. And there was a study done on medieval England that determined that the odds were greater than 50-50 that if you married someone who was born less than 6 miles from you. And that some enormous percentage of people had a very limited geographic range of mixing. And that was then assumed to be true of all parts of medieval world. But as we did more studies, we discovered not only is that not true of most of continental Europe, it's also not true of European port cities. It's not true of of English port cities and of parts of the British Isles that had more contact with other things, or, Cornwall and Wales, which are sending boats back and forth to France all the time, and so on. And yet the world you construct based on that one fact from that one study, which is a real fact that study landed at, turns into a portrait of a world that is then in your imagination and hard to then undo and back away from.
Right. One of my favorite historians of medieval England is a woman named Kathleen Kennedy, currently in Bristol, and she was really a book historian, but she kept finding coconuts and ginger and parrots and other things in late medieval English texts. And so she started to, of course, coconuts is fun if you're a Monty Python fan to think about coconuts in medieval England. And there were lots of coconuts in medieval England. So then, even if you are marrying someone from just a few miles away and you never travel, the world is still coming to you, right? The boundaries of your world remain permeable, and you might see a parrot at the port and have a cup made from a coconut and taste a drink mixed with ginger, or a lot of these things move into medicine, right? You're still part of a world where things are still moving, and you have a reaction to that, and you think about that. I mean, as a medieval person, you encounter these things and think about them and have a reaction, and often it's going to be hard for us as historians to locate that reaction or to make a compelling argument about what it must have meant. But sometimes you can. Sometimes you can by interpreting the context in which they exist.
Yeah, a quick example of that, and then I'd love to, before we're going too long, I want Joe to weigh in, and we can turn to the question of fiction and representations of the bright ages and dark ages there. But the first time I visited Westminster Cathedral in London, we were in a side chapel, and there's a medieval, I think it's 12th century-ish, fresco of the life of St. John the Evangelist. And at the bottom, there's a very clear image explaining the difference between a camel and a dromedary. And it's got a picture of a camel and a picture of a dromedary and the two humps and the one hump, and it labels them, and it's exactly like the illustration on Wikipedia of the difference between a camel and a dromedary. But we don't imagine medieval people having the kind of curiosity we have, where we read it and it says dromedary, and we think, oh, what's the difference between a camel and a dromedary? I want to look that up. And we do in Wikipedia, or earlier than that in the encyclopedia, or earlier than that in the encyclopédie, when there weren't, very many in other languages yet. But medieval people also have this curiosity, and they hear about things and they're interested in. They're just aware of a camel and a dromedary are both a thing that I'll probably never see, or maybe see one time, an exotic one that was brought by a power. Because bringing in exotic animals is another tool of legitimacy, demonstrating things in every city that has a major zoo, right? That you'll see these things just as much as us. But we always imagined a much more closed and curiosity-less world. That I think one of the key characteristics of the imaginary Dark Age is people don't have that curiosity and awareness. They live within a little box. Which the dromedary fresco just made me think of.
And this is what I want from my fiction set in pre-modern worlds, is I want humans, right? I want full humans. They may have different knowledge bases, certainly they do. They may have different perceptions, but I want people who are full humans with all the capacity for all the things, good and ill, as any other human. That's really, when I look for medieval fiction, or medieval-ish fiction, I'm not looking for accuracy, I'm looking for humanity.
So I think the most interesting thing to focus on in the little bit of time we've got left is not so much people using the Middle Ages in fantasy, of which there is a ton.
Thanks, Tolkien.
But the image of the Dark Ages in science fiction, where starting in 1941, science fiction latched onto this idea of the Dark Age following the fall of Rome and dealt with it in different interesting ways. And I think it's fairly obvious why this would happen during the Second World War.
For sure.
Because, they felt that this was a potentially civilization-ending event for the civilization that they recognised themselves in. But it started with L. Sprague de Camp's Lest Darkness Fall, in which a man, for completely unexplained reasons, in Rome in 1941, trips and finds himself in 6th century Rome with a detailed knowledge of what's going to happen in history and interferes with it. That is a very well researched at the time sort of direct attempt of one person trying to avert a dark age. And almost at the same moment, Asimov was writing the first Foundation book,
Mm-hmm.
in which there's inevitably going to be, because of the forces of psychohistory, a dark age across the galaxy, but they can keep it to being only 1,000 years instead of 10,000 years, or maybe it's 10,000 years instead of 100,000 years. I forget, but they can do this by doing things to stave it off. And then just a few years later, Walter Miller's Canticle for Leibowitz.
Mm-hmm.
And that's after there are atomic bombs. And that is preserving science and culture through a dark age in a monastery, where they're hand copying and illuminating blueprints, and deliberately trying to take it forward in a way that nobody actually ever was.
Yeah, really, not even Boethius or some of the figures we point at as this is a person who felt the things were fading and tried to preserve them.
Yeah, I got to say that Canticle for Leibowitz I read in 8th grade and was definitely an influential book in terms of how I thought about monastic culture as I went through my teenage years as a big nerd, and moving into undergraduate years. It was very, very, very powerful for me.
A rare positive book about monastic culture.
Mm.
And I've always kind of liked it. But they are very influential within science fiction of what a dark age is, which in fact no age has ever actually been that kind of dark age.
And then you also, I think, get a lot of science fictional worlds in which there having been a dark age is an enabler of whatever the new society is that has developed, which is another thing you get post and during Cold War, where there's a very plausible way that things could be rendered into a dark age, and that you also get in sort of apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic, however you want to describe it, fiction, which is looking at the new civilizations that are developing either during the immediate fall aftermath or trying to turn from the fall aftermath to the other. All of these different types of works assume a logic in which a dark age is a thing. A dark age is a thing that happens normally and naturally in history, and that you can, even as a very throwaway minor, yes, this civilization developed after there was a dark age caused by roll randomization, fire-breathing cyclopses, or whatever it was that caused the dark age, or space whale ate the sun. And there was a dark age, and now we're in the dark age, or now we're after the dark age, or now we're the plucky preservers during the dark age. All of them work on a logic of that there is a dark age, even if there aren't any monks or anything that actually actively resembles medieval. It's the structure of believing in dark ages at all, as well as in golden ages in between them.
One of the really interesting things, and this is again Petrarch's fault, So medieval thinkers about time, medieval European Christian thinkers about time, to be more precise, had a notion of a dark age, but it was about Christianity, right? That before the incarnation was darkness, and then after the incarnation is not. So
right, the two-part division of history: good, bad early, and then good late.
And they absolutely use the language of light and dark, as one would not be surprised at all if you think at all about Christian theology. It's Petrarch really, and maybe you may know better than I do, but where there's a really important kind of mid-century article about his ideas of dark ages, mid 20th century, and he's got this letter to his French critics, and that's where sort of the I can't remember who wrote the article off the top of my head, but that's where the historian sort of locates him starting to use darkness, but really talk about it not as before and after the incarnation, but after the Roman Empire, ideally until Petrarch, is sort of the narrative. But it's interesting to me that there is a shift in how darkness, golden ages and dark ages get used by by artists and thinkers and such historically, when it's taken out, it makes a certain kind of sense if you have a teleological theology about time.
Yes.
But that when it's about culture and human things, it's a very different kind of work. I mean, if the space whale eats the sun, we very well might be plunged into darkness, right? Because then it's just a thing that happens. Or if, in fact, the Antichrist...
Literal...
Yeah, if the Antichrist arrives and there is, in fact, hell on earth, right? Literally, I think you could make a claim about darkness and light. If it's, well, we were writing poetry in one way and now we're writing poetry in a different way, that's, a little more subjective.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think one of the keys to Petrarch's ability to transform there was a bad early era that didn't have good knowledge, and then there was a good post incarnation and post revelation era, which is the medieval one, to a 3-part one, is that the Middle Ages has a very sophisticated apparatus, which Petrarch inherits, develops, and then hands to later Renaissance people who use it even more, of interconnecting the wisdom of non-Christian ancient figures with the wisdom of Christianity. And, the wisdom of Plato and the wisdom of Cicero are akin to the wisdoms of Revelation. They are, as Petrarch and especially others a little later describe it, they are sort of groping toward it. They are seeing the light distantly. They use, and Thomas Aquinas does this, they use the Platonic image of the divinity as the sun, as the one, as the source of all things, as the source of light, to make this argument that all wise people everywhere in time are groping toward and trying to describe the same thing. And if you have disagreements in their texts, it's the same thing where if you put 10 authors in a room and ask them to write a description of a vase, and then give the descriptions of vases to 10 artists and ask them to draw the vases will look totally different, but they'll have key characteristics in common. There is an apparatus for trying to connect the wisdoms of pre-Christian and parallel to Christianity but non-Christian interlocutor philosophers and respected figures with having the same source of knowledge that Christianity has, which then Petrarch and his successors can use to say this golden age, which is both ancient Greece and Rome in the pagan sense, but also the coming of Christianity, and up through and including Constantine, which our modern thinking about the classical world often chops off and is interested only in pre-Christian Rome. The golden age Petrarch wants includes Christianity, and so it's including a big chunk of that medieval this is good, but it's expanding it earlier and then putting a second age of shadow after.
I wanted to say what you were just saying makes me realize how very hard it is to forget Gibbon, that we're looking at all this through Gibbon's idea that it is Christianity that wrecked the Roman Empire, which Petrarch 100% did not have.
Right.
100%.
And that very much changes the way we think of the Golden Age and Dark Age. Neat.
Yeah. So there's also an obsession within science fiction with Belisarius, who of course comes into Lest Darkness Fall that I just mentioned. But many, many people have done Belisarius on other planets in the future, and Belisarius in fantasy worlds in different ways, because I think Justinian and Belisarius have in a lot of ways within science fiction come to stand for that moment where a dark age could have been averted because of Spraudekamp, I think, because of Lest Darkness Fall. Was there ever a book with a stronger title that is talking about a dark age? So you have dark ages on other planets in the future. And an interesting example is in Lois McMaster Bujold's Vorkosigan books, where Barra-Yar, the central planet where the main characters come from, was cut off from the galactic mainstream when their wormhole closed, and spent 150 years partially terraformed and slipping back into a dark age technologically and socially. And then that has affected everything about their culture in the later books, even though it was actually a relatively short time.
Neat. Yeah, that's a really cool sequence.
They printed out Shakespeare with the last of their power. So they had, a printed Shakespeare, and then they hand-copied Shakespeare. And when they were rediscovered by the galaxy again, there were 2 additional plays that they considered canonical.
Huh. Really
which is
cool.
Just a beautiful
That's a wonderful detail. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, there's a fascinating working with this. There's an anime called Horizon in the Middle of Nowhere. And, there's been a space empire, and then it's been crushed, and humans have been lost most of their tech and been forced to go back to Earth, and Earth is mostly devastated, and we're in Japan. And they have a history as we know it. And they've lost their tech, including their ability to travel in space. So they decide to intentionally reconstruct the events of the recorded history they have in order, with the hope that their tech will advance at the same speeds in the same way, and that therefore they'll eventually get to the space age by faithfully going through all the other eras first.
Oh, please tell me it doesn't work.
It doesn't work. It doesn't work, but it doesn't work because there's a pocket dimension where people pop out and invade them, and then the student council at the high school has to solve the thing. But I mean, it's a great example of a premise that I could imagine 10 different really awesome novels or novel series being made with the same people try to do this, but also that very much has this cycle of Dark Age, Golden Age idea. And it's like, well, let's live in the pretend Dark Age. We're in a Dark Age, so let's make the Dark Age be a Dark Age that turns into a Golden Age. And then if we do all the events of the Dark Age, the Golden Age stuff will accumulate as a result of us doing the correct finale to the Dark Age. And it's an extra interesting thing to be seen doing it, not just that it's a Japanese work, but that they choose to have it be geographically in Japan so that the events that they're reconstructing are Japanese history of this period, not Western. Because there's lots and lots of anime about European history. It's a very favorite topic. There's also lots of anime about Chinese history. And this, sort of archetype of we had a space empire, but now we're in a dark age and we want to get out of it is very much modeled on the European idea of a dark age. And one could very easily see using their reconstructing European history to get to this. And there are many different European history-based anime and manga, but they've chosen to have it be Japanese history, but still having this interesting Dark Age to Golden Age transition meta-narrative layered over it, which is borrowed from not European historical events, but European vocabulary for talking about history and European claims about what structures exist in history, which have been exported all over the place.
So while you were talking, I just thought of 2 interesting contrasting examples, one of which is Donald Kingsbury's Courtship Rites, which is a very, very strange book, published in 1983. It was a Hugo nominee. Very, very weird book about a planet where people landed on the planet, and there are no animals, and there's very little to support life, and they slip into a weird tech level that they can sustain, where they have to be cannibals because there isn't any other meat, and there's a lot of weird things going on in that book. But it's also very, very much got this idea of the Dark Age and trying to preserve things. But it's also got a woman who comes up with a theory of evolution from, even though they only have insects. And she decides to disbelieve their actually true religious narrative that they came there in a spaceship. She thinks that's nonsense, that fully grown human beings could have come to the world in a spaceship and walked off it. They must have evolved on that planet from the insects, even though, it's very hard to construct a method by which they did.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking of that reminded me of Eleanor Arneson's excellent series, of which the novel is Ring of Swords and the short stories are collected in a collection called Hrawath Stories, which came out 2016.
Mm-hmm.
That one, and it is about aliens, and the novel is when they are in space, and the collection is stories of theirs about things, including some science fiction of theirs, which is absolutely fascinating. But the one that I am thinking about, which I absolutely love, which I read when it came out in FNSF, is called The Potter of Bones. And that is about how somebody... It's their Darwin, and she is a Hrawath woman who is a potter, and who, in looking for earth for potting, finds sufficient fossils and things that she figures out evolution.
Neat.
Within their world, but with a logical chain.
Mm-hmm.
And in a medieval society, but not a dark age that's had a fallen empire society, but an interestingly depicted alien medieval period, which is not something you all that often see.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
the same way we see these patterns over and over again with humans having dark ages, we usually see aliens where they're either always primitive or they're always in spaceships.
Yeah, and there isn't a lot of mid-tech level, or there's a lot of in original Trek, for example, there'll be a lot of just at the threshold of the space age. They're at modern tech level, but they don't have spaceships yet, which is why they aren't in first contact category. That tech level will also exist among aliens a lot.
Yes.
The other neat double-layered thing I realized with Horizon in the Middle of Nowhere, the anime where they're reenacting history, is that one of the big points of suspense in the narrative is that their history is going to run out, and they're almost at the end of the book that they're modeling it on.
Oh!
And there's a lot of fear of what's going to happen. Is there going to be an apocalypse or something? What does it mean when we don't know what to do yet after this year? What do we do when the chronicle we were basing this on runs out? Which is a very interesting combination of fearing a historic dark age / apocalypse with other types of apocalypse narratives.
Yes, that's fascinating. That's really, really interesting. And I'm thinking also now about Nicola Griffith's Ammonite, where there's a planet where there's a plague that kills men, so there's only women on the planet, and the planet is quarantined. And they think they may have a fix, and they send a woman down with the fix, but in fact it's not a fix, and she's an anthropologist, and she's trapped there and travels around. And she starts off thinking that this is a dark age, a terrible post-apocalyptic, stranded, one planet cut off thing. And then she comes to realize that in fact, no, they have an incredibly complex culture. They have all the tech that they want.
Oh, neat.
Even the ones who are barbarians, but, horse nomads, have all the tech they want.
Mm.
And that's a very interesting kind of poke at expectations.
Right, and also at the tech tree idea, or the...
very much, yeah.
There must always be progress forward, and we must always want the technology's narrative.
Yes.
That's really cool. So often when Joe and I are talking about science fiction and fantasy, I'll summarize science fiction or fantasy plots from manga or anime, not with any interest in ever persuading Joe or anyone else to read or watch anime who doesn't already. It's a arena that has a high learning curve. You have to invest a lot of energy in it before it becomes really rewarding. But a lot of the plots are really neat to just put side by side with what novels and short stories and television and historical things are doing. So I will bring in anime manga plots as here is a different science fictional thing that is being done. Side note as one of my contributions to the fiction side. So this has been a great conversation, and now by tradition, first we will all briefly gush about a book we've been excited by lately, and then finally we will do the administrative podcast stuff.
But first, David, where can listeners find more of your amazing stuff?
If you go to davidmperry.com, you will see all of my work collected in various ways there. And you can buy The Bright Ages pretty much anywhere that people sell books to anyone. So please do.
And that's coming out when?
It's December 7th, which is a long way away, and yet pre-orders are available now. And just think how much future you will appreciate past you if you buy it today.
Very true. And also, authors always appreciate pre-orders more than anything.
It makes a big difference, as we all know.
Great. So, Joe, what is a book that you've been excited about lately that you'd like to gush about?
So I've recently been reading the work of Bernard Olivier, who is a French guy who, when he retired, decided to walk the Silk Road. So it is a travel memoir of walking from Istanbul to China. In 3 books that were originally written in French, recently been translated into English. The first one is called Out of Istanbul.
What year?
He did it in 1999. He did it over 4 summers. Starting in 1999, but the books were translated in like the last 2 or 3 years into English. The third one's just come out. And the first one's called Out of Istanbul. And if you want to spend time with a delightful French guy going for a long, long walk and talking to a lot of people and thinking about history and landscape and family and how we live and what it means to get older. And when he got home, he started a foundation for juvenile offenders to go for long, long walks instead of being in prison, which I think is the most awesome thing. But I've loved reading those. Thoroughly recommend them.
Fabulous. David, do you have a book you'd like to gush about?
I'm just partially into it. So again, I mentioned that I'm dyslexic, and what that means for me is when I read for pleasure, I listen to books. That is I can speed read my way through a book incredibly rapidly by reading one out of every few words, and it's fine, and it got me through grad school. But if I want pleasure, it's to listen, because my ears are not dyslexic. And so I'm listening to the audiobook of The Hidden Palace by Helen Wecker. It's, The Golem and the Genie was her first book, set in early 20th century New York and around the world. And that's one of those books that just does the kind of storytelling set in a historical place, but not bound by it in any particular way, that just kind of draws me in and holds me there as long as I have time to listen.
I really enjoyed the first one, which I actually read earlier this year. Terrific book. So, Ada, how about you?
Well, mine are often going to be oddball. So, we've recently, finally, with great excitement and anticipation, had the first volume of one of the most influential action manga, action Japanese comics in the history of the field, and it's hugely influential on art, and everyone is familiar with it, etc. Ping Pong Club. Ping Pong Club is finally coming out in English. It's about high school and middle school ping pong club, but it is so intense, and every panel you can see which samurai comics and which space alien battles have borrowed the visual vocabulary of Ping Pong Club. It's such a fascinating window on the development of a genre backwards from far more influential, usually science fiction or fantasy works that have been available for a while to finally getting back to this root of it. So deep into ping pong at the moment in translation in English. Excellent.
Okay, excellent. And now this podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives, International 4.0 license.
Hooray! Thank you, Creative Commons, for making the sharing of material easy. Thank you, David, for joining us. This has been absolutely a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me, both of you.
You can support us and get episodes in advance at patreon.com/Ada Palmer, and you can support Jo and get her wonderful poetry, often about fun history things, at patreon.com/BlueJo.
And you can find us on Twitter and our books and things at joeltonbooks.com and adapalmer.com. So until next time, ex urbe ad astra.
Ad Astra.
Ad Astra.